Sozzi's take today has to do with inflation. We've been hearing a lot of companies talk about this, right? And in particular, you zeroed in on some food companies that have been talking about inflation. Even though the Fed doesn't count that kind because it's transitory, it can affect some of these companies' bottom line, obviously.
Well, maybe they should, Julie. Maybe it's about time, Brian Chung, our Fed correspondent, gets in the ear of Jay Powell and says, you know what, start tracking food inflation a little more broadly because that's what people are paying for in the grocery store. Nonetheless, Jeffrey's out with a good note. Food analyst Rob Dickerson, he has called out 17 food companies, of late that have highlighted inflation in agricultural products, inflation in freight. And now a lot of these food companies are starting to take action. They're redesigning their packages, maybe one or two less pieces of cereal in that bag, believe it or not. They're also starting to look at raising prices. And Julie, you and I yesterday spoke to General Mills CEO Jeff Harmening. He basically said he's looking at all of those things. He is, in fact, seeing inflation in grains. And that, as a result of that, they could be looking to raise prices as well. Are you talking large gains? Maybe not, because your consumers are still going to be resistant to some of these price gains, even though they are getting their stimulus checks. There's a lot of competition down the aisles. You can't go out there and raise prices 10, 20%. Not going to happen. But that brings me to my next point here, Julie. If you can't raise prices so much to offset some of these double-digit gains that the likes of a Jeffrey's is seeing in grains, when does that impact your margins? And Jeffrey's really voiced some concern here. Within 6 months, because of the lag and impact of inflation, that could hit profit margins for a lot of these food companies and could ultimately hit their stocks. Now, the stocks they're doing okay the past month. They're not pricing this in at all, but they could take a hit, as second and third quarter earnings come out here and margins are under pressure.
Well, maybe these investors, like the Fed, are looking at these food price changes as transitory, right? Or fuel changes as transitory. And, that's the reason the Fed doesn't tend to count this stuff as much because, as we know, when you watch these prices, they're pretty volatile. So you want to see if they're going to be lasting before you make any kind of decision based on it. Speaking of lasting effects, Goldman Sachs taking an interesting look at inflation in the wake of different kinds of world events. And they looked at pandemics. I don't know if the history of pandemics is not, especially in the modern era, I'm not sure if it's like for like, but talk to us about the chart that they brought up.
Yeah, Goldman Sachs makes the contention that it's not normal that after a pandemic, at least going back to their research, you see sustained large increases in inflation over a period of time. And they call out two reasons for that. One, you have the loss of physical capital because of the pandemic. So that you have no loss of physical capital because of the pandemic. And two, government spending, in this case, they would suggest stimulus checks. They just come in and fill the hole in economic output caused by the pandemic. So it's not like a new inflation is being created here. Really a lot of technical terms there from a Goldman. But the bottom line is, while they acknowledge the likelihood of short-term inflation, longer term, it's unlikely to be too out of hand because of the pandemic.
Well, that does make sense. And that also feeds into what we have heard consistently from the Fed, right, in terms of their willingness to let inflation approach a 2% and even exceed a 2%. On the question of pass-through of price increases, to your point that you were bringing up earlier, I was listening to an interview on Bloomberg this morning with Patrick Harker, president of the Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank, and he said for now, producers in his region are not passing on those prices, which is in line with what you were talking about with some of these food producers. So that's an interesting trend and one that really bears watching to see if it changes. So quite interesting that we are watching in terms of that.